San Diegans accomplish great things every day. We care about our neighbors and our community. We are proud of our diversity. We are resilient. We hold our leaders accountable. We live in one of the most dynamic cities in America, the San Diego Union-Tribune, telling San Diego's story for more than 150 years.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gail F. Baker, Vice President and Provost at the University of San Diego.
And I'm Dr. Noelle Norton, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences here at USD.
For the second year in a row, USD, along with its College of Arts and Sciences and Humanities Center, is proud to return as the presenting sponsor for the 2021 San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books.
As a university deeply committed to the liberal arts, USD promotes a form of lifelong learning that ignites curiosity, builds critical connections across different ideas and topics by seeing them from unique perspectives.
Our partnership with the Festival of Books enables all of us avid readers to come together as a community alongside renowned authors from all over the world and to dive deeply into imaginative stories and important themes.
Yes, books do have the ability to open minds and hearts. On behalf of the University of San Diego, we thank you for joining us for today's program to explore the world of books with us.
Enjoy the presentation.
SDCCU is an engaged community partner. Each year, SDCCU is proud to support many nonprofit organizations throughout Southern California. Our partnerships allow us to help shape the financial lives of many through volunteerism, financial support, and creating public awareness. The result is a big impact on the communities we serve. SDCCU, it's not big bank banking, it's better. Federally insured by NCUA. Find out more at sdccu.com.
Hi all, welcome to the Festival of Books, Meet the Author Q&A series. I'm Joshua Emerson Smith, environment reporter for the San Diego Union-Tribune. Today's session welcomes authors Kim McCoy and Samantha Montano. Kim is an author and oceanographer who recently crafted the third edition of the marine science classic Waves and Beaches, The Powerful Dynamics of Sea and Coast. Samantha is an expert in emergency management who wrote the book Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. Kim, let's start with you. You've spent years at sea, including in remote polar regions. Very interesting. But first, the first edition of this book was initially written in the 1960s by a mentor of yours, if I'm not mistaken, Willard Baskin. Will you tell us about how the book impacted your early career and how you came to form a relationship with Baskin later in life?
Yes, thank you for having me. Willard Baskin and I became friends in the late 90s, although I had used his book, the first edition of Waves and Beaches, in graduate school when I was studying coastal wave dynamics. And that certainly influenced me early on. And luckily, the first real job I had in oceanography was in coastal wave dynamics. And Willard Baskin was a very broad and talented guy. He knew presidents and did all sorts of wonderful things, but you can read about him on Wikipedia.
And how did you meet him?
I met him at the Deep Submersible Pilots Association meeting in San Diego in the late 90s. And he was talking about getting gold from a wreck called the Brother Jonathan. And after that, I went up to him, thanked him for writing the first edition of Waves and Beaches. And he said, well, I'm not really interested in these modern wrecks with gold and stuff. I'm interested in a bronze from the age of Pericles. And that's where we clicked in ancient history.
Interesting. And did you ever think that you would be forming a relationship with this guy who wrote such a classic text that informed your early life?
Not at all. We used to meet once a week or so after the Deep Submersible Pilots Association. We interacted quite a bit, once or twice a week, and he would give me things to read, and I'd sort of like father to son homework kind of thing. And after a year or two, he handed me a copy of the second edition of Waves and Beaches and said, Kim, read this. and tell me what it needs. He had this really deep voice. And was taken aback, it's like, me tell Willard Baskin what his book needs? And so I did, and he liked my edits, if you will, and here we are 20 years later.
I mean, how much time did you end up spending with him before he passed away?
A couple of years. We interacted pretty well. I mean, we'd share birthdays and other things. You know, I know his whole family. I know his every generation down to great grandchild. So I'm intimately involved with the Baskin family still, although they have different last names. And it's, you know, it was sort of like a father-son experience, although he was about 35 years or so older than me. And he died in the year 2000. And so the effort of doing the second edition sort of went moot for a while because he had passed away, but he had just received the rights back from Doubleday just prior to his death. And his daughter, Anitra, asked me to, well, would you want to do a third edition? I said, well, I'd be honored to do it. And I was in Italy for 5 years. I was gone back and forth, and finally hooked up with the publisher Patagonia. And over the last 5 years, eked out this very substantial change for the third edition of Waves and Beaches.
Yeah, it seems like this is almost a new work of art here that you have created. I'm wondering who did the design, because the book Waves and Beaches, the third edition here, I mean, the art in this thing is just gorgeous. Just the pictures are amazing. Who put all that together?
Well, some of those the diagrams, and so the figures are modern versions of Bascom's line drawings that he did himself. He actually drew them himself. Those are black and white. Myself and Christina Speed and another person, Brett Daniel, turned these all into Adobe Illustrator stuff. And then myself and Christina Speed and Jane Sievert, the picture editor, decided on all the pictures. So I was intimately involved in every aspect of the book. A couple of those diagrams are my original ones, beautiful surfing images. So it's really a merging of Bascom's experience and my experience over the last 70 years. And not my experience in 70 years, but Bascom started in about 1946.
Yeah, it really is a gorgeous book to hold and even just flip through. Quite remarkable. I think you did a very good job on this third edition. Let's switch gears really quickly. Samantha, your book draws heavily on your personal experience, right? Notably, time spent in post-Katrina New Orleans as a teenager. Can you tell us about how those experiences informed your career path and what drew you to places that are suffering from disaster like this?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I, as you mentioned, got started doing disaster work in New Orleans post-Katrina. I grew up in Maine, but I had gone down to the city after the flood to do some just volunteer work. And when I got there, I was just completely blown away by the scope and scale of the destruction there. I'd never seen anything close to it before. And I was really struck by how long it seemed the recovery would take, how many people would need to be involved in that recovery, how many needs were going unmet throughout the city, and particularly in certain neighborhoods like the Lower Ninth Ward. And so I ended up moving to New Orleans, doing all kinds of recovery work in the city. And I ended up being in New Orleans when the BP oil disaster happened. And so we ended up going down to the coast to help with that response and recovery as well. And that kind of led me down this path to finding these other disasters that were happening around the country and starting to find a lot of different similarities between the challenges that were coming up in these events. And that led me down a path to going to grad school to learn about what research says about disasters and how we should manage them. And that really is kind of what led me to the work I do now, teaching, researching, and speaking publicly about disasters and what we can do to make our response to them go better.
And you do a lot of different things besides teaching, right? I saw you were testifying before Congress recently. What's that like? I mean, it seems like your work is more relevant now than ever. Are you feeling that personally?
Yes, I don't sleep much. I have been very fortunate to be able to take on more of a public-facing role and be in a position to share research, not only my own research, but to share a great depth of research from other disaster researchers from decades past, from all over the world, and really talk to not only local communities and local community organizations about how that research may affect the work that they're doing in their own communities, also work with emergency managers directly to see how research can influence their practice, and also really fortunate to have the opportunity to be able to talk with policymakers and other elected officials to try to, again, see what we can do to kind of influence our emergency management policy and make it more effective and put us down a path towards disaster justice.
Seems like such grim work in a sense, very overwhelming. I mean, do you feel like this is something that chose you, or you chose this line of work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I knew probably within 24 hours of going to New Orleans the first time that disaster work was what I should be doing. And in the process of writing this book, I also have done a lot of self-reflection, and you can see kind of different elements of disaster affecting me even before I went to New Orleans, literally from birth, that kind of make a lot of sense that this is where I've ended up. But I will say, when I was in New Orleans, I knew nothing about emergency management. I did not have any sense of anything related to disasters. I was very focused just on New Orleans itself, and really at first viewed it as kind of this one-off kind of crazy thing that happened, rather than being the product of all of these policy decisions, and even not necessarily connecting that to what our risk in the future, given climate change and development decisions, what that would actually look like. So certainly I knew disasters was the path for me, but exactly what that path was has kind of been a bit of a surprise.
And is it something that's been rewarding? Are you happy with this, or does it feel frustrating at times? It is really frustrating constantly, right? There are, disasters that happen every single day somewhere in the world, and you see a decision made that's the wrong decision. You see a policy not be implemented that should be. You see the destruction that comes with these disasters. And it is endlessly frustrating. But at the same time, we know what to do to make emergency management better. We know the kinds of policy changes that we need. We know what needs to happen at the local level, state level, federal level. And it really is a matter of actually getting these policies implemented. And in that sense, I am hopeful as, there are more disasters happening across the country and around the world. People are, I believe, paying more attention to this. And I'm hopeful that in the near future, we'll see some real movement on how we think about it and how we really manage our risk. Yeah, for anyone interested in reading Disasterology, it is a surgical dissection of everything that could go wrong with disaster relief in case after case, right? I mean, you're really picking this apart and showing how so many people fall through the cracks in these efforts. It's quite compelling.
Thank you. Yeah, that was really the goal for me for writing this book, was to really provide a framework of how people can think about disasters, rather than just having us, be really reactive in responding to them. How can we look at the bigger picture here and try to be proactive?
And with that through line of climate change, Kim, I want to switch back to you. I mean, you really kind of spiced up this latest version of the classic, right, with climate events and disasters over the last 2 decades. Can you tell us how the original texts, right, which involves a lot of scientific diagrams and explanations about how waves and beaches work, basically just from a scientific perspective. Can you tell us how that informs the climate events related to oceans that we're seeing today? Why is it important to package this all together?
Well, I think what Samantha covers from a disaster management aspect and what Waves and Beaches covers from what causes the waves and the storm surges and the saltwater intrusion. So Waves and Beaches looks at it from a causal vantage point, and it certainly provides a few topical suggestions of what to do. But for instance, I believe, Samantha, you were at the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. To show the complexity of that, well, it sank because of an explosion and then because of waves and other things, but it sank in the ocean. And the jurisdiction is super complex for that. It was built in Korea, leased to a British company, BP, owned by a Swiss company, operating in U.S. waters, flagged in the Marshall Islands. So who's got control to manage the disaster? It's a disaster of disaster managements. And so with sea level rise, there's no singular explosion with sea level rise. It's like a leak in your roof. And eventually, the beams are rotten and your roof's rotten and it ruins your furniture. And you go, I can't keep buying new furniture. So with sea level rise, Miami, for instance, is spending $500 million over the next 5 years just on pumps and manners of keeping the salt water out of their drinking water and other things. The Port of San Diego here in San Diego have all sorts of coastal structures at risk. And Jakarta, Indonesia is dealing with relocating the capital of the country because they've been battling a sea level rise for 20 plus years. And here in Del Mar, just north of where I think Joshua and I sit, the train tracks are under siege and they're falling in. They've assessed that it will take several $1 billion to reroute it. Who's going to pay for that? So when the disaster happens, unfortunately, the techniques that Samantha describes that have been implemented, they haven't even been thought of really from a fiscal vantage point. How do you account for all that? And countries like the Netherlands do an excellent job with their Delta Works project. So, Waves and Beaches looks at the causal, how waves are formed, how they propagate, how they interact in the coastline. And then I surge in topic into geopolitics. But what Samantha does is really describes how humans interact in a policy manner. I touch on policy a little bit.
Yeah, we should mention, here in California, we can't stop talking about wildfires as our predominant natural disaster, but on the Southeast, flooding is the big issue, right? And we do have a taste of this with the Del Mar Cliffs. And what we're going to do about that, of course, it will have to be public money that pays to realign the train tracks there. But yeah, I mean, these are the issues that we're dealing with now across the country.
And it's not just physical, Waves and Beaches more like the physics of ocean wave propagation, the physical interaction. But remember biota, the animals, and we're part of the biota of Earth, they interact with the physical structure. So how healthy the sand supply is from upstream and whether or not the watershed is getting enough water to move sediments towards the coast intimately connects, what sort of halibut live in the seagrass and whether or not there's adequate nutrients going into the ocean to satisfy the sardines, which in turn, the larger fish eat. So it's all really, really connected from a natural environment, and we're just part of that process.
Yeah, it strikes me that both these books are great reading for particularly elected officials and decision makers who often come at this from a layman's perspective, but have to make important decisions based on their understanding of science. And both of these books are accessible to a large degree and could help people as we make these tough choices, I think.
Yeah, Waves and Beaches Waves and Beaches has about 150 references in the back, and 10 climate change action plans are referenced. Unto those have over 1,000 pages of references. So
it's a
access point.
It's a very you've really kind of jazzed up what was kind of a textbook, I believe, to begin with.
I've tried to do that.
Yeah, well done. Can you give us? I mean, Kim, you've been all around the world on ships. Can you give us a personal story of seeing the impacts of climate change? I mean, what have you seen firsthand?
I did.
What strikes you?
Well, I did 7 or 8 trips to the Arctic, 1 to the Antarctic, and when I first went to the Arctic in, I think it was 1980, we went to areas off the west coast of Greenland that had not been accessible since the 1840s. As a matter of fact, the last group that went there died. Sir John Franklin.
Because the ice was too thick?
Too thick. They got stuck in the ice and they overwintered and they tried to walk out and they all died. But anyway, we were the first group to go in there in 1980 on an icebreaker. And then now, 40 years later, cruise ships go up into that area. The ice is really diminished. And then in the south, in Antarctica, on the Antarctic Peninsula, the penguin species that have been living there for 5,000 years are being supplanted by warmer species of penguins. And so there's bones and stuff like that you can carbon date to get an idea of which species were there over what periods of time. They know 5,000 years they've been there. So now they're getting supplanted, and these are visible changes. And like here in Southern California, here in San Diego, we have a lot less kelp. Kelp is like the forests that our forests are burning. In essence, our kelp forests are burning. The kelp coverage is really, really diminished in Southern California, and they're finding kelp further north. Well, okay, that's fine, but the whole ecosystem, the kelp coastal ecosystem is, I won't say it's collapsing, but it's certainly massively under stress. When the land has warm periods, remember there are heat periods or heat waves in the ocean also. And these are 5 to 10 degrees warmer than normal. And so all the biota in the ocean is getting stressed during these heat periods. Most people live on land. They've never been to sea. But I went swimming 2 days ago and in the ocean. It was great. I'm going, after this interview, I'm going again, swimming from the cove to the shores. And it's super warm. It's great for swimming.
Yeah, anyone who lives in San Diego knows that, the beaches have been warmer of late, right?
So,
okay. Samantha, just tell me, you detail so many disasters in your book. What's the through line that you want the reader to take away from this? Like, what do you want people to really walk away from this understanding better?
Well, I think the biggest thing is that all of these disasters that happen, and I talk about Katrina, I talk about Hurricane Maria, Harvey, other smaller floods in Texas, like the Tax Day flood. I talk about repetitive flooding on the coast of Maine. Talk about my experience living in Fargo, North Dakota with flooding. And so these disasters on their own are kind of on their surface seem very different, but really they have many more similarities than they do differences. And I think sometimes when you live someplace that experiences a disaster, or you're in an area that kind of has a repetitive type of hazard that you see again and again, it's kind of easy to think that what is happening in your community is really, really unique and you're the only one experiencing this. And what I hope this book does is demonstrate that actually this is an experience that a lot of people are having, which on the one hand, that's terrible. But on the other hand, that means that there are bigger policy changes that we can do to shift some of this risk that is occurring, that we can talk about national policy changes that go down and have an effect at the local level. We don't need to go necessarily community to community making all of these tiny, small individual policy changes, because frankly, given the urgency of this situation we're in right now, we don't necessarily have time to do that. And so hopefully this book demonstrates and shows people that you are not alone in your community, that there are other people experiencing this. I hope it inspires some of these local groups to reach out to other groups across the country and start working together and lobby for changes to our emergency management policy, but really ultimately to demonstrate that disasters are not inevitable, that even given what we're seeing with climate change, given the decades of poor development decisions that have been made, there are still things that we can do to prevent disasters from happening, or at least minimize the destruction when they do happen.
What would I don't want you to feel like you have to go into a wonky policy debate here, but what would be your top prescriptions? What can we do to scale up disaster relief in the United States?
Sure. So if we're talking at the national level, obviously there needs to be a lot of focus on FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Currently, FEMA is one agency within the Department of Homeland Security. That was a post 9/11 change. So taking FEMA out of DHS, returning it to independent cabinet level agency is kind of disaster researchers' number one policy recommendation. Past that, we really need to be talking about growing the capacity of our emergency management system across the country. Every community has an emergency manager, emergency management agency in some form. But unfortunately, in most places, especially rural communities, you have a part-time emergency manager who's kind of doubling as the fire chief, and doesn't give them a lot of resources or time or necessarily the appropriate expertise to really be doing this hazard mitigation, this preparedness that we know needs to happen. So really growing that capacity, hiring more people, increasing the funding of our local emergency management agencies would be huge in enabling local communities to even do things like apply for mitigation grants through the federal government, to start doing those mitigation, those climate adaptation projects that they want to be doing in their communities.
I think that we're going to start to see a lot more of the resiliency, or what do they call it? Resiliency or adaptation strategies going forward. A lot of what cities have been doing over the last 5 years is trying to figure out how they can shrink their carbon footprints, and most of the money has gone into developing climate action plans, et cetera. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to realize, hey, the impacts of climate change are really coming home to hit us hard where we live, and we're going to have to spend money on trying to figure out how to live in a warmer climate.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. We are unfortunately at the point where we did not act quickly enough on climate, and now we are dealing with the repercussions. And there are still things that we can and have to do to prevent climate change from getting worse, but we are experiencing the consequences of it now, and we can't forget those communities that are on the front lines of these consequences. And we also have to understand that disasters don't have just one cause. It's not only climate change that is causing this increase in risk. It's development, it's vulnerability, it's all of these decades and decades of policy decisions that have kind of come together and led us to this point that we're at now. So I absolutely hope you are right, that there is going to be more of a focus on adaptation. And I really hope too that as we start focusing on climate adaptation, we recognize that emergency managers have been doing essentially that for a very long time in terms of mitigation, right? These kind of go by different terms, but we've been buying out homes for decades, right? When we talk about managed retreat, we want to be making sure that we're not completely reinventing the wheel, but really using the knowledge and resources and experience that we do have in emergency management and applying it to this kind of climate adaptation context.
Kim, do you have any thoughts on how San Diegans can prepare for coming heat waves and sea level rise?
Well, understanding the mechanisms, the phenomena that create the disasters, I think is fundamental, or potentially creating a disaster. For instance, in the Netherlands, they had a terrible flood in the 50s, you know, the boy and finger in the dike kind of thing. And they realized, well, thousands of people died there, and they took a national policy. And what we need, I'll echo off of what Samantha just said, we need a national policy to approach these problems, because climate change is not just a local issue. It's really an international, it's global. We live in a globalized climate, a globalized world economically. And you can't dissociate what's happening in a port in China or the Indian Ocean without recognizing that when something happens there, it's going to change your insurance rates, the cost of your goods. So here in San Diego, for instance, La Jolla Shores, you know, it's got a problem. The upper bay in the South Bay of San Diego Bay, where the salt flats and all that, well, they won't be around there anymore. And well, what are you going to do with that? They want to build stuff at Seaport Village. Well, I hope they're building those on stilts, because not that it's going to, I mean, planning things for the long term is much better. That's the most cost-effective way for anything. So instead of planning something, oh, we're going to put a patch on the road, and 6 months or a year later, it's falling apart. The coastal structures need to be approached that way. So nothing should be built that shouldn't be able to withstand not only the structural requirements of 100 years, but also the anticipated climate change-induced changes that almost certainly will be occurring at the limits of what we think they are now.
Probably one of the most controversial or hottest topics is the use of seawalls to try to protect property and infrastructure along the coast. Of course, that means that you're basically doing away with the beach in those areas. What do you think when you see seawalls?
Well, it's sort of a schizophrenic approach, because, just go to not Penasquito's Lagoon, but just right there as you enter into Del Mar. Upstream, they permit sand mining. Downstream, they do beach nourishment. Go figure. I mean, it's schizophrenic to do something like that. And they need to recognize that putting in a seawall somewhere can be good for the entity right behind the seawall, but unless you're doing something gigantic like the Dutch have done with a national policy, little patches on little coastal portions of land aren't going to do much. 40% of the land between San Diego and LA is armored, as they say, with seawalls or concrete or riprap. That's great, but the advance is still going to go around those little tiny patches and undermine it, and it'll fall into the ocean. The city of Pacifica up near San Francisco is a very good example. Some of the coastal houses have caissons going down 40, 50 feet, and you can see those now exposed completely. They're hanging off in free space as a house falls in. So you really have to recognize you shouldn't permit in areas that are in harm's way. And as Samantha mentioned, you can buy houses and buy real estate at a national level to preclude the damage, because if you're fixing the damage, what was Hurricane Katrina, 500 million or something like that? And you can spend 50 million and keep it from happening is much better than having $1 billion in reserve for a disaster. So it's understanding first the phenomena that create disasters, and those that can be mitigated, approach them properly and long-term approach, and those that cannot be mitigated cost effectively, just retreat. That's my 2 bits.
Well, grim topics, but important reading from our authors today. Kim McCoy, who crafted the 3rd edition of Willard Bascom's scientific classic, Waves and Beaches. And I just want to say again, God, this book is gorgeous. Anyone out there definitely should just get this to look at it, if not read it, of course. And Samantha Montano, who penned Disasterology, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis. This is a master class in what has gone wrong with disaster response over the last 20 years. And thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. To the audience out there, you can purchase either of these works from a number of independent booksellers. More information is available at bookshop.org/shop/SDFOB. Also, please consider supporting the San Diego Council on Literacy by visiting literacysandiego.org. And if you've enjoyed this program, watch more author panels at sdfestivalofbooks.com. Thanks again for clicking in. I'm Joshua Emerson Smith. This has been the San Diego Union-Tribune's Festival of Books Meet the Author Q&A series.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jose Cruz. I'm the CEO for the San Diego Council on Literacy. We work with a network of 29 youth, adult, and family literacy programs that annually serve 160,000 residents of all ages at no cost. Our mission is to unite the community to support literacy. It's an exciting year for us. It's our 35th anniversary. It's also the 5th anniversary of the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books. The San Diego Council on Literacy is a beneficiary of this event. So when you participate, you support literacy, especially through the author panels and just in general. So when you participate in this event, you also make it possible for another person, a child or an adult, to improve their reading and writing skills so they can read the books that you read. We have our favorite event activities. We like the Storytime Hour, and you probably have your favorites too. So we hope that you'll join us at the San Diego Union-Tribune Festival of Books and learn more too about the work of the San Diego Council on Literacy by going to literacysandiego.org. Thank you.